Welcome to our seventh theme, and welcome is the key as perfection welcomes failure. I started this chapter by describing a very bad day at your first job. Remember Sarah, who is the young new nurse who was scared to death of Nurse Katarina Reichart, the supervising nurse on her floor. Sarah's a float pool nurse working on the OB unit, second shift, just hoping to avoid any big mistakes. You remember what happened. Sarah didn't know she was supposed to care for both the mothers and the babies. She just looked after the mothers. Then, at the end of the shift, she realizes what she's done just as Nurse Reichart walks up. What would you do if you were Sarah? Run! You messed up in the worst way, and Nurse Reichart is the last person you want to see. That is, unless Nurse Reichart would be God. Then you would strangely run towards her. That's our seventh theme. Perfection welcomes failure. This is a theme which deals with the extremes of perfection and failure. Small errors get swept under the rug, hoping to be hidden. But when we're truly guilty and there is no way out, then we're drawn to God's perfection. Small mistakes tempt us to avoid perfection. Only really huge mistakes drive us to face absolute perfection. Only those who step the farthest back from excuses are going to be nearest God. Paul admitted he was the worst of sinners, and yet found that this was the path to the righteousness of God. Those imagining themselves holy continue in their sins, while those who admit that they are the worst are justified. Remember Sarah? If Nurse Reichart would only come along and say, "Everything went well today?" I'm sure it did. Wouldn't it be tempting to say, sure, everyone's fine, then leave as fast as deception allows? Flimsy excuses try to fly straight away. But real spiritual truth is a boomerang. A boomerang has two equal-length arms, and so does this theme. We know God's holiness just as we know our sinfulness. Yet these two opposites cause us to turn and return to the very God from whom we first fled. We only know the holiness of God, but we don't face our own sins. We'll be like Adam and Eve, blaming each other and God. We'll be the Pharisee who went to the temple to pray, full of his own goodness and despising the tax collector. But there's no coming near God in that speech or flight. But a boomerang brings you back to the start. Remember what Nurse Reichart says when she comes up on Sarah, just when she realizes she should have checked on the babies? Nurse Reichart sees the empty chart and says, "You know, when I was first here, I did a whole shift once without ever checking on the mothers. All I looked at was the babies. Only at the end did it hit me that I was supposed to worry about the moms too. So maybe you'll want to stop in and see the babies one more time before you go. In fact, let's divide them up, you and me, so it doesn't take you so long and you can get home." Did you see this coming? Never. Not from Nurse Reichart. But when Nurse Reichart's perfection is knowledge matched by mercy, she's perfect. You no longer want to transfer off Nurse Reichart's unit. After all, she's perfect. Christ is that perfection for us. Hebrews 4:15 and 16 says it best. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. His perfect endurance of these temptations without sin might be expected to drive us away from him, but he draws us to himself by not only knowing the temptation, but by standing under the judgment of the sins themselves. We approach the mystery of Jesus' innocent bearing of guilt with silence. It's too deep to understand, but too generous to be questioned. We come as the tax collector did to the temple and say, "Have mercy on me, a sinner." So there is a purpose for the journey that leads first to dark fear and hopelessness. God's patience is not a blind endurance of sin, God's patience is the creative turning of that sin to the point where it is disarmed before the perfection of God. Then perfection welcomes failure, draws it surprisingly forward, and hears its cry for mercy. That mercy creates a new heart, a new relationship, and sends us out as living examples of the reclamation that God alone can produce. Thank you for making this journey through the 7 themes of patience and perfection. You have certainly shown divine patience. Now in this last segment, we're going to look a bit beyond the 7 themes and consider the other possible themes the Bible has. As you've noticed, all our themes bring us to Christ. He is the goal of every biblical pattern, and we'll continue to see that in the new themes that this chapter suggests. I've been reading motorcycle magazines since I started riding motorcycles in 1970. My first bike was a used 1967 Yamaha 305, and I've always liked those bikes from 1967 on to the early 70s. The best motorcycle magazine back then was Cycle magazine. I began subscribing to Cycle in 1972 and got every issue to its end in the early 1990s. I've kept every issue. Recently, I discovered that online auctions have Cycle for sale from the years I missed, from 1967 to 1972. Usually, I buy them one at a time, but once I got a windfall. 12 issues of Cycle from 1967 to 1968. Cost? $10 for all 12. What a deal! Well, they are a little musty, and so to air them out, I spread them across the seats of the Model T in the garage so that by now they're fine. But imagine what I bought for just $10. More of what I love to read and have never read before. You just don't find that every day. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the same were true of the Bible? What if we had a new chapter to read today and a whole new book waiting for us this winter? But it's unlikely that any new letters from Paul will be found. Besides, whatever we might find would only tell the same truth. Jesus is the Son of God, and we have life by his life, death, and resurrection. Still, it would be exciting to have something new to read. I hope that the 7 themes have given you new perspective on familiar Bible stories. Now, there are 2 more ways to expand what is still new in the Bible. First, we'll combine 3 or 4 of the themes as they intersect in the same Bible account. You've likely done some of that as you've been reading already. We talked of a biblical story, and you thought of a previous theme and connected that theme with the text we're discussing. So, we'll bring these together with several possibilities. Think of us braiding together 2 or 3 threads this way to make something strikingly new. Second, besides using the 7 themes that we have here, I'll suggest new themes. You've likely done this also as we've gone along. My list of 7 is only my list. Yours is likely much more creative. I'll suggest some possible themes that might ignite your creativity, but your ideas will be better than mine. We can start by asking familiar Bible stories a simple new question. Which of the 7 themes is working here? The answer could be more than one, as we saw in this chapter. Also, as you see patterns occur, you can ask another new question. What's connecting these events and people? You can go backward and forward on the contextual river, asking when you have seen this before and when you might see it again. Then you begin to braid the 2, 3, or 4 biblical narratives together to make a single theme that includes them all. One of the reasons I love reading the old Cycle magazines is to remind myself of how much work old motorcycles were. Set the choke, crack open the throttle just enough, and then kick, kick, kick. If you read 50-year-old Cycle magazines while sitting in a 100-year-old Model T Ford, you'll really gain an appreciation for modern engines. Reading the lives of many biblical people leaves me feeling the same way. My life is so simple compared to theirs. What are my problems compared to the life of Paul, for example? First of all, consider the conversion of Paul, Acts 9, as a wonderful example of grace upends your world. Paul is spoken to by God and given new direction in life, but he's blind as a result and defenseless against his enemies. His world certainly turned upside down. God patiently endured his persecutions of the Christians, but then, in a shattering moment, God made it perfectly clear that that past life was over. Paul became the last of the apostles, as he described himself. I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle. In this, he is the second, which is greater than the first. In Acts 1, the disciples must select a new 12th apostle to take Judas's place. By lots, they choose Matthias. We expect nothing more since the roster is full. But Matthias is just the first, and a much greater second apostle must be added, the unlikely 13th, Paul, the former persecutor of the church. Paul's selection as an apostle surprises us, since we never thought that this man, the persecutor of the church, would become the greatest missionary, God cured with the illness itself. Another striking surprise focused on one man comes with Elijah and the contest with the prophets of Baal. First, Elijah uses the expectation that greatness ought to look like greatness. Elijah proposes to the people that the God who answers with fire, he is God. The people agree, since this side of the greatness theme is natural to us. Unafraid of the result, Elijah lets the prophets of Baal go first, using most all of the day. Their first attempt comes to nothing, while Elijah's simple prayer will be greater beyond imagining. In his waiting, as a mirror of God's own waiting, Elijah shows the patient relationship God offers his people. But to turn them to himself, God will also act with instant, perfect fire from heaven. Finally, Elijah draws the people towards the altar where the fire will fall, saying, "Come near to me." And all the people came near to him. Fire from heaven is coming, and yet this perfection draws the people towards him. What a combination of drama, danger, and greatness comes with these men, Paul and Elijah. Paul and Elijah are great collections of our themes brought into one dramatic day. But biblical themes are also found in the extended lives of many. It's a bit like Holly's collection of cookbooks. She is a wonderful cook and is often trying out new recipes. All good. But usually the best recipe is already here. Her caramel apple cake is the best cake in the world. It's Cortland apples, walnuts, made from scratch caramel topping, and enough flour to call it cake. Serve it warm, maybe with vanilla ice cream on the side. I dare any other cake to even show up. A perfect recipe only needs a few strong ingredients that match each other well. Apples, walnuts, caramel, and flour are what you need. So two-sided greatness, a wonderful patient relationship, an illness becoming the cure, and grace that upends your world are the ingredients for one of the most loved stories, the story of Ruth. Think of the patient relationship that Ruth embodies. She remains with her mother-in-law, Naomi, despite the loss of her husband and her father-in-law. But Ruth will not abandon Naomi, a perfect picture of caring relationship. But due to the famine, the women must travel back to Naomi's home, so the illness of the famine will become the cure by moving them. Ruth will then be a Gentile widow in the land of Israel, her world certainly being turned upside down. It's hard to imagine that she could see the grace that was coming, but we recognize God's hand in the kindness and care shown to her by Boaz. When they marry, and we are told that Ruth will be the great-great-grandmother of King David, then we see both sides of greatness. Ruth's humility and poverty are the hidden side of the glory that will come in the line of David. Following someone else's recipe is fine, safe, and repeatable. But sometimes you want to make your own. Now it's your turn to make your own biblical theme. I suspect you've been doing that all along. You've noticed repeated patterns of action and seen God meet people in familiar ways. With all that, you're ready to suggest your own biblical themes. However, if you're not sure of possible biblical themes, I'll suggest 3 ideas that might work for you. The first is the single verse, Psalm 30, verse 5. For his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning. Here is another of our familiar 2-part themes, with a sharp contrast between them. We know these opposites of weeping and joy so well. The night of weeping stretches our patience. Nothing goes slower than a long night of worry or pain or loneliness. Time stops, but our mind is racing with worry. But this verse promises that a morning is coming in which there's joy. It's not just understanding or appreciation of why we needed a troubled night. No, actual joy also has to come. What a wonderful promise made by David, and better, made by God himself to everyone who reads and believes. Another possible theme involves a situation that is repeated many times over in the Bible. The barren woman has a child. Think of the examples, both those which are famous and those lesser known. Sarah and Abraham have their only son Isaac when Sarah is 90. Then we have other Old Testament examples, such as Hannah, the mother of Samuel, who prayed earnestly for a child. Also, there is the birth of a child to the Shunammite woman who befriended Elisha and was granted a son. She then lost her son to a sudden illness, but Elisha raised him up from the dead. These women prepare us for the births of John to the elderly Elizabeth and the birth of Jesus to Mary. What summarizes these important births? How would you capture the waiting by these women? Waiting sometimes in patience, sometimes in resignation. What does the gift of a child say about the creative power of God, his love for expressing himself through his own creation, and his purposeful plan for these so unlikely born children? I'll leave to you to formulate the exact name and phrasing of this theme, but these births deserve to be recognized. The birth of an unexpected child deals with what is new. The opposite is the center of our third new theme. It might be called, I'll work with what I have. The idea is that God, who can create anything in an instant, bears in patient relationship with what is already here. God chooses to work with what he has already created. For example, in changing water into wine, John chapter 2, Jesus could have created wine out of thin air, but instead he used the water, the well, and the servants who were already there. In feeding the 5,000 and the 4,000, again, Jesus could have showered bread from heaven, but he used the small existing meals of bread and fish, multiplying them instead of creating a new meal from the air. Jesus himself shows this theme with his incarnation into our human flesh, being in the genealogical line that stretches from Adam to himself. God's love of his creation and his patient endurance with it comes out beautifully when he works with what he has already made. Finding these new themes, or joining several themes together, gives us something new in a familiar book. It's like the motorcycle ride that I described in this chapter. No one really needs to ride a motorcycle on an icy December Wisconsin morning. But it was a good ride, even though it was on the same roads I've ridden on 1,000 times. Looking east, the sun was splashing a streak of light on Lake Michigan. Turn west for home, watch the roofs sparkle from the frost. For a December morning in Wisconsin, it was a perfect morning ride. No matter whether you've just come off the road or are sitting at home, I hope that you have had the same feeling as you look at your well-worn Bible. You've turned the corners from Matthew to Mark, from Galatians to Ephesians. So often, there's a trail worn between them. What's there to see anymore? I don't know, but I do know two things. You've never seen these words in the light of today, and you'll never see what's new if you don't take the trip. So go down that same road again. Turn the corner from Philippians to Colossians and say to yourself, I wonder what I'll see today. Maybe it will be one of the same themes again. Maybe it'll be something altogether new. You've never seen it like you'll see it today, and you'll never know unless you take the trip. Throughout this book, we've discussed perfection and patience repeatedly, both as a first theme and as a tension through all the following themes. Even here, in formulating your own biblical themes, perfection and patience are at work. You know there's a biblical pattern waiting to be seen, even more than just the three I suggested just now. But if the exact words don't come for you right away, be patient. The perfect pattern isn't going anywhere. The biblical text isn't going to be sold out from under you. It's unlikely you're going to find someone else has worked out your theme before you do. So be patient with divine perfection. You'll have time to fill out the examples and define the action and its importance. The right words and understanding will come. In fact, praying about that would be a wonderful example of patient relationship waiting for his moment of perfect insight. I trust that the interaction of these two, perfection and patience, have been expressed in various ways with each theme. We want instant perfection and a lasting perfection that comes in our dimensions and fills out our definition of perfection. But God's timing stresses patience above all, and His perfection so often uses the very opposite of what we expect. So don't be dismayed when the first is not everything you hope for. Be patient. Another is coming. Don't be caught up in the many people and the worries each one brings in your life. Don't despair as the problems multiply faster than God's answers. He loves to answer all with one solution. He thrives on standing alone, one in place of us all. I trust that you will continue to work with these two key ideas of patience and perfection. You'll continue to see new repeated actions and key ideas throughout the scriptures, and will also reorganize our list here with your own new pieces. Perhaps no list will ever be perfect, since now we see in a mirror dimly, but that's all right, as the patience of God is pleased by our reading and thinking over again and again what He's done. His perfection is expressed perfectly in His patience over us. Look for the landmarks of His repeated actions. Be comforted by what you expect, and rejoice in what is new again in today's travel. God bless your reading His Word as a journey, both familiar and new.